So, I've arrived in South Sudan. My name is Dr. Matthew Jones, and this is my first day in South Sudan, where I am a volunteer with CMMB and also an Aurora Fellow, with a sort of, roughly speaking, a 6 to 12 month commitment project here to work as a doctor. I arrived this morning flying from Nairobi, and immediately I was met by the sort of a degree of chaos which I had been pre-warned about, and I certainly don't want to be seen to be laughing at it or to take a flippant or glib attitude to anything here which might be described as chaotic. South Sudan is a country that has obviously suffered and continues to suffer really as much as any country in the world. For those who don't know the history, South Sudan broke away from Sudan in 2011 after a long struggle. Unfortunately, 2 years later, it itself fell into civil war. The civil war, I do not understand it fully, and I really assume that it's probably much more complicated than even people who've been here for a long time would completely understand. It seems to me to be a sort of combination of sort of national, regional, and local conflicts. Where I happen to be going, which is the west of the country, a place called Nzara, it doesn't seem to be particularly, relatively too heavily affected. Anyway, so I arrived at the airport this morning, and immediately you're aware that you're arriving to somewhere with less infrastructure than you've probably ever seen before. So the airport itself might be described as having sort of certain shed-like features. They are actually building a new airport, to be fair. So you queue for a passport, and you're on a dirt floor. A variety of people sort of approach you with seemingly wearing, the only uniform I could identify was the Hawaiian shirt on a few of them. And one of them sort of seemed to be offering, the opportunity to buy the visa there, which I didn't believe was possible, and I'd sort of gone to some lengths to get it in Nairobi, and I briefly wondered whether or not I was being offered something sort of, illicit on the black market. I don't think that was the case, but it did make me laugh. And then I met the representative from the charity, CMMB, who, John, very nice guy. He then sort of took me through leaving one area and then entering the baggage control area, which, to clarify, was about 5 meters from the passport area, and just featured the bags having been taken off the plane and essentially just dropped by the shed. My bag was there, absolutely fine, and whilst one can be a bit snobbish about the process, I wonder whether or not they probably lose fewer bags than Heathrow Airport, when they essentially just take the bag and physically carry it directly to the passengers waiting. And passed through security controls, which was about a yard further on, and the very pleasant security guard sort of simply looked at my bag. I opened it and he saw a mosquito net and a towel, and that seemed to satisfy him, and just like that I was through. So very quite straightforward passing through the process. I must confess that it was a lot easier than the last time I went through Gatwick or Heathrow Airport. When I'm sort of talking, I don't want to sound, as I mentioned already, glib or flippant, and as I said, this is a country that has suffered tremendously. I think it's very easy to arrive in a place like this and think that one starts to come to understand it because one can make a series of flippant observations about dress or the standard of security in an airport. The reality is that there are a whole set of influences, deep influences in this country which I may never come to understand. I may not have the ability to understand, and I certainly, the only hope I have of understanding them is to be sort of humble and just listen and try to avoid any sort of flippant, glib generalizations, as tempting as at times as it is. I think when we travel, we do have this temptation, which is really born out of, I think, a sort of an insecurity, sometimes a loneliness, far from home. That desire to sort of, to believe we understand a place. I think sometimes that can come at the expense of a truer, deeper sort of connection to the place. I've just spent a very useful hour in the CMMB office with Dr. Martin, who is the medical expert here in Juba, and he has outlined the sort of the structure of the healthcare system here. It's fascinating. It's fascinating to sort of just start to see that faint imprint, or the faint imprint rather, in my head of how the healthcare system works here. It's noticeable that there is a clear structure here. I think it's probably, certainly before I arrived, it was easy to imagine that as I think potentially one of the most fragile and poorest countries on the planet, that I would be arriving and it would be a blank canvas and there wouldn't be much organisation. There certainly is theoretically a great deal of organisation. I think probably the reality on the ground may not necessarily, that organisation may not be quite so apparent. It may be, potentially, it could be a slightly more theoretical construct, and the reality on the ground could be a little bit different. Certainly one possibility. It's very interesting because during these video diaries, what I want to do is I want to record both. I want to take an approach which I've talked about in my other video, which is to look at things both from an exterior perspective, but also then to have a more interior attitude. So in terms of the exterior, I predominantly want to be here and come to understand a little bit. I want to sort of describe, I want to, have the privilege of an outsider perspective and see how a healthcare system like this works, with a view potentially then to, with that understanding, to be able to offer that to the charity, to the hospital, and also then to raise awareness beyond to help sort of raise funds and generally sort of promote understanding of places like South Sudan and the hospital I'm going to. I think, and I refer to these as the kind of sort of as the light pieces I do. I think there is also a sort of a degree of introspection which I'll bring to this, which I hope will be a valuable tool as well. The extent to which I'm prepared to kind of analyse and look deeper beneath the surface. I think having all the data and describing that data is very important, but I think one has to then sort of pull something out of that. I think on the first day, just in South Sudan, not having even seen the hospital, I feel a degree of sort of trepidation and nerves as to whether or not I'm really going to be able to offer anything here, whether I can provide any value, any use. I certainly, would fear, ultimately having a very sort of shallow and superficial relationship here, being in a sense almost like a sort of health tourist, or and then just going home and spending the rest of my life saying I'd spent 9 months in South Sudan, thank you very much, box ticked. It's interesting because I think therefore with that sort of professed insecurity, I think there is this temptation then to think, well, I'll throw myself into it. I'll throw myself into the clinical work, and I'll prove my value and prove my worth. I hope that on the ground, I hope that ultimately I will be able to find a balance, the important balance, which will involve, work, clinical work, but also that ability to step back and see things from the outsider perspective to describe. I think that my greatest strength, well, let's not necessarily make that judgment, but let's just say that I think that I can offer something in both domains, the sort of the descriptive side, which can lead itself to things like service improvement and change in the way things are done here, as well as the sort of pure engagement and the pure medical function. I'm sort of conscious that I'm probably to some extent losing the narrative thread I set out to demonstrate here, and that's really a consequence of the fact that I've been here for one day. These are just really some opening thoughts, some opening sketches on paper. I hope that over time that these video blogs will sort of demonstrate a sort of a greater level of understanding, a greater focus, and a greater coherence. I'd like to think that, if nothing else, this sort of video blog demonstrates an open-mindedness and a flexibility, and a commitment to not necessarily be coming at this from simply one angle, whatever that angle might be, whether it be just purely to get clinical work or purely to sit and describe and offer suggestions. I would like to, whether or not this experience, extends beyond the sort of the 9-12 months, who knows, but I'd like to, at the end of the 9-12 months, at the very least, believe that I've done something more than just go through the motions, tick boxes. I'd like to, over the next 9 to 12 months, properly engage with the culture, with the service that they offer, and ultimately try and form some relationships with the people who are doing predominantly the hard work over a long period of time. I think without those relationships, one really is just passing by as a tourist, and that to me would be a very disappointing experience, and certainly not one that would. Anyway, let's move away from the introspection, and let's just say that it's wonderful to be here, and I sincerely, deeply look forward to this journey. Thank you very much.